December 24th, 1944, the Ardennes forest, Luxembourg. A wounded American soldier lies bleeding in the snow, enemy bullets tearing the frozen ground around him. The Germans are closing in, so close he can hear their boots crunching through the ice, their officers shouting commands. His comrades are trapped, surrounded, about to be slaughtered. Private Lloyd St. Germain has one hand pressed against the radio on his back. The other grips the microphone. Blood soaks through his uniform, turning the white snow crimson beneath him. He knows he's dying, but he's still on the air. And then he does something that will leave the Germans furious, stunned, and retreating in absolute panic. He calls in coordinates that will rain artillery fire directly on his own position. In his final moments, this one wounded radio man is about to stop an entire German assault. This is the story of how one man's last transmission became his greatest act of defiance. The SCR 300 radio weighed 38 pounds. Lloyd St. Germain had carried it through France, through the mud of autumn, through the early snows of December. 38 pounds of olive drab metal, vacuum tubes, and wire mesh, strapped to his back like a mechanical hunchback. The antenna collapsed down to 4 feet, but when extended, it stretched to 8 feet of whipping steel, announcing his position to every sniper within 500 yards. Radio operators didn't last long. St. Germain was 22 years old, a farm kid from South Dakota who'd never seen an ocean before enlisting. He had steady hands, a quiet temperament, and the kind of reliability that made officers tap him for the radio. He hadn't wanted it. Nobody did. But when the sergeant had asked, "St. Germain, you good with machines?" He'd said yes, because that's what you said. That was August. Now it was Christmas Eve, and he was still alive, a minor miracle for a man walking around with an 8-foot lightning rod on his back. The 317th Infantry Regiment, 80th Infantry Division, had been pushing through Luxembourg for 3 days. They were Patton's boys, part of 3rd Army, and they'd been told the Germans were finished, beaten, retreating. Intelligence said the Wehrmacht was a spent force, incapable of mounting any significant offensive. Intelligence was catastrophically wrong. On December 16, 1944, 250,000 German soldiers had exploded out of the Ardennes forest in Hitler's last desperate gamble, what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. By Christmas Eve, the entire Allied line was in chaos. American units found themselves surrounded, cut off, fighting battles they hadn't expected in places they couldn't pronounce. St. Germain's platoon, 40 men from 2nd Battalion Dog Company, had been ordered to advance through a forest near Kemmen, Luxembourg, to establish a forward observation post. The trees here were old, their branches heavy with snow that muffled every sound. It was the kind of quiet that made your ears ring, the kind that preceded violence. Lieutenant James Kearney, their platoon leader, was 24 and new to command. He moved at the front of the column, one hand raised in a loose fist, the signal for caution. Behind him, the men spread out in a tactical formation, rifles ready, breath clouding in the frozen air. St. Germain walked in the middle of the column where radio men belonged, close enough to the lieutenant to receive orders, far enough from the front that maybe, just maybe, he'd survive first contact. The forest opened into a small clearing. Snow lay pristine and undisturbed, a white canvas under the gray December sky, 50 yards across, maybe 60, the kind of space that tactically minded men learned to fear because open ground meant exposure, and exposure meant death. Kearney raised his fist higher, full stop. The column froze. Something was wrong. St. Germain felt it before he could name it. The snow was too perfect. No animal tracks. No signs of German retreat. Nothing. "Sir," whispered Corporal James Rodriguez, crouched beside a snow-covered log, "this feels like—" The forest erupted. Machine gun fire ripped through the clearing from 3 directions simultaneously. MG-42s, the German guns that fired so fast they sounded like tearing canvas, 1,200 rounds per minute of industrial death. Tracers drew lines of red fire through the white air. Men dropped instantly, some dead before they hit the ground, others screaming, clutching wounds. St. Germain hit the snow hard, the radio slamming against his spine. Around him the world dissolved into chaos. The crack of rifles, the deeper boom of German potato masher grenades, the wet sound of bullets hitting flesh and wood. "Ambush! Get to cover!" Kearney was shouting, but his voice barely carried over the gunfire. The platoon scattered, diving behind trees, into depressions, anywhere that offered even an inch of protection. But the Germans had positioned their guns with precision, overlapping fields of fire that left no safe approach. Saint Germain crawled behind a fallen log, snow spraying around him as bullets chewed the wood to splinters. His hands were shaking, not from fear, though there was plenty of that, but from adrenaline, the body's chemical response to imminent death. He could see Germans now, maybe 80 yards away, positioned behind a snow-covered berm. Gray-green uniforms, coal scuttle helmets, the distinctive shape of the MG-42's receiver. More were appearing from the tree line, at least a company-strength force, maybe more. They'd walked into a prepared ambush, the kind that was designed to annihilate, not just delay. A bullet punched through the log 3 inches from Saint Germain's head. He pressed his face into the snow, tasting dirt and ice and copper, his own blood from where he'd bitten his tongue. "Stay Germain," Lieutenant Kearney's voice raw with urgency. "Get on that goddamn radio. Call battalion. We need fire support now." The radio. Right. That's why he was here. Saint Germain rolled onto his side, shrugging the SCR 300 off his back with practiced speed. His fingers found the power switch, turned it. The tubes needed time to warm up, precious seconds while the Germans continued their murderous work. Around him he could hear his platoon returning fire, the crack of M1 Garands distinct from the German Kar 98Ks. 20 seconds, the longest 20 seconds of his life. The radio hummed to life. Saint Germain extended the antenna, slowly, carefully, because sudden movements drew attention. 8 feet of steel whip antenna, rising above the log like a flag announcing, "Here, shoot here." The Germans saw it immediately. Bullets converged on his position with renewed fury. The log disintegrated. Snow exploded in fountains. Saint Germain pressed himself flat, making his body as small as possible, and brought the handset to his ear. "Dog 2-6, this is Dog 2-1, over." Static. Then miraculously a voice. "Dog 2-1, this is 2-6 actual, go ahead." Battalion headquarters. Someone was listening. 2-6, we are under heavy attack, grid coordinate." Saint Germain's training took over, his voice steady despite everything. He read off their position from the map in his breast pocket, squinting at it through the smoke and snow. "Enemy force estimated company strength, multiple MG-42 positions, requesting immediate artillery support, over." "Dog 2-1, confirm. You're in contact with enemy force." "Affirmative," Saint Germain shouted over a nearby explosion. "We are heavily engaged. We need—" The bullet hit him in the left side, just below his ribs. The impact spun him partially around, the radio handset flying from his grip. He didn't feel pain immediately, just a massive punch like someone had swung a baseball bat into his torso. Then came the fire spreading through his abdomen and the wetness, warm and wrong. He looked down. Blood was already soaking through his field jacket, dark and spreading fast. "Medic," he said. Then louder, "Medic!" But the medic, Tommy Harrison from Ohio, was 40 yards away, pinned down behind a tree, trying to reach a man who was screaming with both legs shattered. Saint Germain pressed his hand against the wound. Blood welled between his fingers, hot against the frozen air. The radio lay beside him in the snow, the handset dangling by its cord. The voice from battalion headquarters, tinny and distant. "Dog 2-1, say again, over." "Dog 2-1, do you copy?" 2 men crawled toward him, Rodriguez and Private First Class Mike Sullivan, a big Irishman from Boston. They were low crawling, using every scrap of cover. But the Germans had them zeroed. Bullets tracked them across the snow. "Stay down!" Saint Germain tried to yell, but his voice came out weak. "Stay the fuck down!" They kept coming anyway. Because that's what you did. You didn't leave a man behind, especially not the radio man, not the lifeline to battalion, to artillery, to salvation. Sullivan reached him first, grabbing St. Germain's jacket. "We gotta move you, Lloyd. Can you?" "No." St. Germain's hand shot out, gripping Sullivan's wrist with surprising strength. "No evacuation. I stay here. I stay on the radio." "You're hit bad, man. You need—" "I stay here." Rodriguez arrived, breathing hard, his face gray with fear and determination. "Lloyd, you're bleeding out. We need to get you back to—" St. Germain looked at them both, and in that moment he understood something with perfect clarity. If the radio went silent, if they lost contact with battalion, the platoon would die here, all of them. The Germans would finish their assault, and 40 men would become 40 bodies frozen in the snow. "Get back to your positions," he said quietly. "Let me do my job." Sullivan opened his mouth to argue, but Rodriguez grabbed his shoulder. He understood. The bigger picture. The calculation. One man's life against 40. They crawled away. St. Germain pulled the radio closer, wrapped the handset cord around his wrist so he couldn't drop it again, and keyed the transmit button. 2-6, this is Dog 2-1. Still here. Requesting fire mission. Over. The German assault was textbook. They'd set up their machine guns in a classic L-shaped ambush with the base of the L across the American line of advance and the vertical leg positioned to enfilade, to fire down the length of the American position. It was the kind of setup that turned organized units into panicked mobs, that transformed tactical retreat into rout. But Lieutenant Kearney's platoon wasn't routing. They were pinned, bleeding, dying, but they were holding their ground, firing back with the grim determination of men who knew they had nowhere to run. St. Germain could see the battle unfolding from his position behind the disintegrating log. Each burst of German fire was answered by the steady crack of American rifles. Grenades sailed back and forth, exploding in white fountains of snow and black fountains of earth. The air smelled of cordite and pine sap and blood. The smell of every small unit action since men first learned to kill each other efficiently. His side was on fire. The bullet had gone clean through. He could feel the exit wound in his back, larger and messier than the entrance. That was good in a way. No bullet fragments to worry about. But the bleeding wasn't stopping, and he could feel his strength leaking away with each pulse of his heart. Focus. Job first, death later. 2-6, targets as follows, he said into the handset, his voice remarkably steady. Training, hours and hours of radio procedure drilled into him until it became reflex, until he could do it bleeding and dying and half mad with pain. He called in the German positions one by one, his eyes scanning the battlefield, translating what he saw into the language of artillery, grid coordinates, distances, concentrations of enemy forces. His hand shook as he marked his map with bloody fingerprints, calculating deflections and ranges. Primary target, enemy machine gun emplacement, grid 846327. Secondary target, enemy infantry concentration tree line, grid 846332. Request SHE, fire for effect. Over. High explosive shells. Not smoke, not illumination, the killing kind. Dog 2-1, fire mission acknowledged. Time to impact, 6 minutes. Can you hold position? 6 minutes, 360 seconds, an eternity in combat. Affirmative 2-6, we're not going anywhere. Because they couldn't. The Germans had them fixed in place, and any attempt to withdraw would turn into a massacre. Their only hope was to hold on, to keep fighting, and to pray that American artillery could reach them before German infantry did. St. Germain dropped the handset and fumbled for his canteen. His hands were clumsy now, fingers not quite responding correctly. Shock, probably. Blood loss. He managed to unscrew the cap, took a long drink of water so cold it hurt his teeth. The water tasted like metal and life. Around him the battle continued its ancient rhythm. Fire, movement, cover, fire again. Men screamed orders and curses and prayers. The snow was no longer white, but trampled gray and brown, splashed with red in places where men had fallen and bled. Lieutenant Kearney was still alive, still fighting, his M1 carbine barking in short, controlled bursts. Rodriguez was behind a tree 20 yards to St. Germain's left. his Garand clanging as the en-bloc clip ejected, that distinctive ping that let everyone know he was reloading, vulnerable for 3 seconds. Sullivan was somewhere on the right flank, his bar laying down suppressive fire, the big 30-06 rounds punching through German cover. But they were losing. Saint-Germain could see it, could feel it in the way the German fire was intensifying, becoming more confident. The attackers were preparing for their final push, the moment when they would stand up and charge across the remaining distance, when firepower would give way to bayonets and rifle butts, and the brutal intimacy of close combat. His radio crackled. "Dog 2-1, this is Fire Direction Center. Artillery is ready. Confirm target coordinates, over." Saint-Germain grabbed the handset, pulling it to his mouth. His vision was blurring at the edges, darkening. "Not yet. Not yet. 2-6, coordinates confirmed. Primary target is at the mortar round landed 15 feet away. The explosion picked Saint-Germain up and slammed him back down, his head bouncing off a rock hidden beneath the snow. His ears rang with a high, pure tone that drowned out everything else. The world tilted, spun, refused to settle into stable horizontals and verticals. He couldn't hear. He could see his lips moving, see Rodriguez's face, mouth open, shouting something, but no sound. Just that terrible ringing, that sense of being trapped inside his own skull. The radio. Where was the radio? There, 3 feet away, the handset still crackling with static, with voices trying to reach him. Saint-Germain crawled toward it, dragging his useless legs, leaving a smear of blood across the snow. His whole left side was numb now, which was better than the fire had been, but also worse because numbness meant nerve damage, meant his body shutting down non-essential systems to preserve the core. His fingers closed around the handset. 2-1, Dog 2-1, respond. Are you still operational? He keyed the transmit button, tried to speak. No sound came out. He tried again, forcing air through his throat, making his vocal cords work through sheer will. Still. Here. The words were slurred, barely intelligible. Fire. Mission. Stands. Dog 2-1, we're getting reports of heavy German concentration your area. Recommend immediate withdrawal to negative. The word came out as a roar, fueled by rage and terror, and the absolute certainty that withdrawal meant death. We are engaged. We cannot withdraw. Fire that goddamn mission. A pause. Then, Roger, Dog 2-1, rounds incoming, 30 seconds. Saint-Germain's hearing was coming back, slowly, like someone turning up the volume on a radio. He could hear the battle again, the crack of rifles, the chatter of machine guns, the screams of wounded men. And something else, something new. German voices, shouting, close, too close. He turned his head, pain lancing through his neck, and saw them. German infantry rising from their positions, forming up for the assault. Gray-green figures with rifles and submachine guns, with grenades hanging from their belts, with the hard faces of men who knew how to finish a fight. They were coming. The American line intensified its fire, pouring everything it had into the advancing Germans. Men fell, but more kept coming. This was the moment, the crisis point, when battles were won or lost not by tactics or firepower, but by will. By which side wanted to live more, wanted to win more, was willing to die more. Saint-Germain could hear artillery now, distant thunder rolling across the sky. The shells were coming. But were they coming fast enough? The Germans were 70 yards away, 60, running through the snow, their boots kicking up white spray. "Come on," Saint-Germain whispered. "Come on, come on, come on." The first shells arrived like the hand of God reaching down to smite the earth. They didn't whistle. That was movie bullshit. They simply arrived. 4 105mm high explosive shells landing among the German positions with perfect precision, turning snow and earth and human bodies into a fountain of destruction. The sound was beyond sound, a physical force that compressed the air, that stopped hearts mid-beat. The German assault faltered. Men dove for cover. The machine guns fell silent as their crews scrambled away from the impact zones. "Fire for effect!" St. Germain screamed into the handset, "Fire for effect! You're right on target!" And the artillery opened up in earnest. Battery after battery, 8 guns per battery, firing in coordinated salvos that turned the German positions into hell on earth. The shells came down in clusters, walking back and forth across the tree line, detonating in air bursts that sent shrapnel scything through anyone caught in the open. Snow vaporized, trees exploded, men simply ceased to exist, there one moment and gone the next. The German assault broke. They retreated not in panic, but in that disciplined German way, bounding back by fire teams, covering each other, but retreating nonetheless. The machine guns went silent. The mortar fire stopped. The pressure on St. Germain's platoon eased, then lifted. They'd held. St. Germain let his head fall back against the snow, the handset still clutched in his hand. He was so tired. His body felt like it belonged to someone else, something distant and unimportant. 2-1, this is 2-6. Artillery mission complete. What is your status? We're still here, St. Germain managed. Enemy withdrawing. Casualties? He tried to count, turning his head to look across the battlefield. Bodies in the snow. American bodies. Too many. Kearney was down, clutching his shoulder. Sullivan's bar was silent. Rodriguez was still shooting, but slowly, methodically, like a man running on fumes. Heavy, St. Germain said. Need medevac, need. Help is coming, son. You did good. You did real good. St. Germain wanted to answer, but the darkness at the edges of his vision was closing in now, narrowing his world to a tunnel, to a pinpoint, to nothing. His last thought before unconsciousness took him was simple. We held. St. Germain woke to pain, not the sharp, immediate pain of the bullet wound that had subsided to a dull, grinding ache, but a deeper pain, bone deep, the kind that announced serious damage to serious places. His whole left side felt wrong, disconnected, like meat hanging from a hook. He was behind the same log, but someone had moved him slightly, had packed his wound with bandages that were already soaked through with blood. His rifle lay beside him within reach. The radio was still there, still operational, the indicator lights glowing green. How long had he been out? Minutes? Hours? The light hadn't changed much. Still that flat, gray winter afternoon light that made everything look washed out, colorless. The battlefield had gone quiet. No gunfire, no explosions, just an eerie silence broken only by wind through the trees and the labored breathing of wounded men. St. Germain tried to sit up. His body refused, muscles simply not responding to commands. He managed to roll onto his side, and that's when he saw what had happened while he'd been unconscious. The Germans had come back. They hadn't retreated. They'd regrouped, reorganized, and now they'd surrounded the American position. He could see them in the trees, gray-green uniforms barely visible among the pines, but present, watching, waiting. A voice spoke from his left. Lieutenant Kearney crawling toward him, one arm hanging useless from the shoulder wound. His face was white with pain and blood loss, but his eyes were still sharp, still tactical. Lloyd, you with me? Yes, sir. His voice was a croak. Good, because we've got a problem. Kearney settled down beside him back against the log. Germans have us surrounded. They're not attacking, just holding us here. I think they're waiting for reinforcements. More troops to finish what they started. St. Germain processed this. How many of us left? Maybe 25 still combat effective. Rest are dead or too wounded to fight. We're low on ammunition. No grenades left. And we can't withdraw because they've got all the approaches covered. What's the plan? Kearney laughed, a brittle sound. Plan? We hold until dark, then try to infiltrate out in small groups. Maybe some of us make it. He paused. That's the best case scenario. Worst case? They bring up heavy weapons, mortars, assault guns, and pound us to paste before we can move. Or they just wait for us to bleed out. Either way, by tomorrow morning, we're all dead or captured. St. Germain looked at the radio. Still working. still connected to battalion, to the artillery batteries, to the machinery of American firepower that could reach across miles to deliver salvation or death. An idea formed in his mind. Terrible, unthinkable, necessary. "Sir," he said slowly, "what if we called in fire on our own position?" Kearney stared at him. "What?" "Artillery, right on top of us. The Germans are close, 50, 60 yards at most. If we called it in tight, called it right on our coordinates." "That's suicide, St. Germain." "It's a chance." St. Germain's voice was gaining strength, fueled by the clarity of the idea. "We dig in as deep as we can. Tell the artillery to use proximity fuses, airburst. The shrapnel will scythe overhead, kill anyone standing. But if we're pressed flat in depressions—" "Some of us might survive," Kearney finished. He was silent for a long moment, doing the calculation. 25 men alive now, all dead by tomorrow. Or take a chance. Suicide artillery, maximum danger. But maybe, just maybe, break the German stranglehold and escape in the chaos. "It's insane," Kearney said. "Yes, sir." "We'd be killing ourselves." "Or saving ourselves." Another silence. Somewhere in the trees, a German voice called out, singing actually some Christmas carol in a language St. Germain didn't understand. Christmas Eve. He'd almost forgotten. Back in South Dakota, his family would be gathering around the tree. His mother would be making her famous apple pie. His little sister would be pestering everyone about presents. He'd never see them again. He'd known that since the bullet hit him. The wound was too severe, the blood loss too great. Even if they evacuated him now, he'd die in the ambulance or in the aid station or in the field hospital. Hours, maybe, if he was lucky. Minutes, if he wasn't. But he could use those hours, those minutes. He could spend them doing something that mattered. "Sir," St. Germain said, "I'm not going to make it anyway. We both know that. But I can stay on this radio. I can adjust the fire. I can make sure those shells land exactly where we need them." Kearney looked at him with something like awe. "You'd have to stay on the air the whole time, exposed, while artillery is landing on your position." "Yes, sir." "The Germans would concentrate all their fire on you the moment they saw what you were doing." "Yes, sir." "Lloyd, someone has to do it, sir, and I'm already dead." The words hung between them, terrible and true. Kearney closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked very young, very tired, very human. This was the weight of command, making decisions that would kill men under your charge, accepting those deaths as necessary, living with them afterward, if there was an afterward. "All right," Kearney said finally. "I'll pass the word. Tell the men to dig in as deep as they can. Anything that gives them cover. Logs, rocks, depressions in the ground. They need to be flat when the shells hit." "Yes, sir." Kearney started to crawl away, then stopped. "Lloyd, that thing you're about to do, I'm going to make sure they know about it. I'm going to make sure everyone knows. Your family, the army, everyone." St. Germain smiled. It hurt. "Just make sure some of you bastards survive to tell the story." "We will." Kearney crawled away, moving from position to position, whispering the plan to each man. St. Germain could see the reactions: shock, disbelief, grim acceptance. This was what combat did. It reduced men to calculations, to acceptable losses, to necessary sacrifices. He picked up the radio handset. 2-6, this is Dog 2-1. Fire mission over." "Dog 2-1, go ahead." St. Germain took a deep breath. The next words would condemn him to death, but they might save 25 men. Simple arithmetic. 2-6, I need a fire mission on the following coordinates. He paused, looked at his map, at the blood-stained numbers that marked their position. Grid, 846315. A longer pause this time, then, Dog 2-1, those are your coordinates. Affirmative. Say again, you're requesting artillery on your own position? Confirmed. Enemy forces have surrounded us at close range. We need danger close fire support, proximity fuses, airburst pattern. We'll take cover. But we need that fire now. Dog 2-1, the voice from battalion headquarters sounded shaken. We can't authorize that without... There's no time for authorization, St. Germain shouted. The Germans are about to finish us. Either you fire that mission or we're all dead anyway. Your choice. Another pause. Voices in the background arguing, discussing. Then a different voice came on the line. Older, calmer, carrying the weight of authority. Dog 2-1, this is Colonel Harris, battalion commander. I need you to understand what you're asking for. Those shells will land within 50 yards of your position. The shrapnel from proximity-fused rounds will have a lethal radius of... I know what I'm asking for, sir. Son, this is... Colonel, respectfully, we're out of time. The Germans are getting ready to assault. Either we do this now, or you'll be recovering bodies come morning. Sir. The longest pause yet. Saint. Germain could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, could feel his life ticking away in beats per minute, each one precious, each one spent. All right, Private. Fire mission approved. May God have mercy on us all. The colonel's voice was rough. Rounds incoming, 2 minutes, get your heads down. Understood, sir. Dog 2-1 out. St. Germain dropped the handset and cupped his hands around his mouth. Incoming, get down, everyone down now. The Americans pressed themselves into the earth, into any depression, behind any cover. Rodriguez wrapped himself around a tree root. Sullivan lay in a shallow ditch, hands over his helmet. Kearney was behind a boulder, his good arm tucked against his body. St. Germain extended the radio antenna to its full height, 8 feet of steel rising above the battlefield like a beacon, like a target. The Germans saw it immediately. They understood what it meant. That goddamn radio man was still alive, still calling in fire, still fighting. Every German gun in the forest seemed to open up at once, all of them focused on that single point, that one soldier who refused to die, who refused to surrender, who was bringing death down on his own position. Bullets ripped through the air around St. Germain, so close he could feel their passage, hot wind against his face. The log disintegrated under the concentrated fire. Snow exploded. Ice shards cut his face. A round grazed his helmet, spinning it off his head. He pressed himself flat, one hand on the radio, the other clutching the handset. And he waited. The shells came. They didn't whistle. They arrived like thunder made solid, like the atmosphere itself tearing open. Proximity-fused 105mm rounds detonating 20 feet above the ground, sending thousands of steel fragments scything through the air at supersonic speeds. The sound was beyond comprehension. The world became noise and pressure and violence. Saint. Germain felt the shrapnel pass overhead, felt fragments punching into the log beside him, into the radio, into the ground. Something hit his leg, a burning line of pain that barely registered against the cacophony. But he was still alive. The Germans were not so fortunate. The shells had caught them in the open or in positions that offered protection from ground fire, but not from airburst. Men standing were cut down instantly. Trees were stripped of branches. The carefully prepared defensive positions became killing grounds. Through the smoke and chaos, St. Germain could hear German voices, not singing Christmas carols now, but screaming, calling for medics, shouting orders in panic. He grabbed the handset. 2-6, adjust fire, 50 yards north, give me another salvo. Dog 2-1, you're still alive? For now, fire that mission. The artillery responded with beautiful, terrible precision. Another salvo, this one walking north through the German positions, finding the machine gun nests, the command posts, the rally points. Each shell was a hammer blow against the enemy's will to fight. The German fire was slackening now, becoming sporadic, disorganized. Men were pulling back, abandoning their positions, choosing survival over victory. Keep firing, St. Germain transmitted. They're breaking. Hit them while they're running. The artillery kept up its deadly work, shells landing in a pattern that hurted the retreating Germans, that punished them for every step they took, that transformed their withdrawal into a rout. And then, suddenly, it was over. The shells stopped falling. The German guns went silent. The forest was quiet except for the ringing in St. Germain's ears and the crackle of small fires started by the explosions. 2-6, mission complete. St. Germain's voice was barely a whisper now. Enemy. Withdrawn. Position secure. Dog 2-1, medical evacuation is en route. Hold on, son, just hold on. But St. Germain knew there was no holding on. His body had given everything it had, and there was nothing left. The wound in his side was cold now, not painful, the ultimate warning that blood loss had become critical. He could see his platoon emerging from cover, see them standing, looking around in amazement that they were still alive. 23 men. He counted them slowly, his vision dimming. 23 out of 40. Not good odds, but better than 0. Rodriguez reached him first, sliding into position beside him. Lloyd. Jesus, Lloyd, you beautiful crazy bastard, you did it. You stopped them. St. Germain tried to smile. Radio? Still works? Who gives a shit about the radio? We need to get you. Tell my mother. St. Germain's voice was fading. Tell her I thought about her apple pie at the end. You'll tell her yourself. You're going to be... But St. Germain wasn't listening anymore. He was thinking about South Dakota, about wheat fields in summer, about the way snow looked on the barn roof on Christmas morning. He was thinking about how strange it was that he'd traveled thousands of miles to die in a forest he'd never heard of, fighting for people who would never know his name. No, not fighting for them, fighting for the man beside him, for Rodriguez, for Sullivan, for Kearney and the 20 others who would go home, who would tell their children about this day, about the radio man who called fire on his own position and held the line with his last breath. That was enough. That was more than enough. Private Lloyd St. Germain died at 16:47 hours on December 24, 1944, in a forest near Kemmen, Luxembourg. He was 22 years old. The SCR-300 radio on his back was still transmitting when his heart stopped. 3 days later, when American forces finally pushed the Germans back and secured the area, they found the battlefield exactly as it had been left. The bodies had frozen in the positions where they'd fallen. German and American alike, preserved by the December cold like specimens in a museum of violence. The snow had covered some of them, nature's blanket thrown over the dead. But what the advancing American troops found most striking, what would appear in after-action reports and intelligence summaries, was the condition of the German positions. They'd been annihilated. Not just defeated or pushed back, but systematically destroyed by artillery fire so precise, so concentrated, that it had left the German company strength force reduced to scattered survivors. Equipment lay abandoned. Weapons were still in position, their crews dead beside them. The aftermath of the battle told a story of catastrophic defeat snatched from the jaws of certain victory. The Germans who'd survived, the ones captured in subsequent operations, told interrogators the same story over and over, with variations that spoke to trauma rather than embellishment. They'd had the Americans trapped, surrounded, outnumbered 3-1. It was supposed to be a simple mopping-up operation, one more small victory in Hitler's desperate Ardennes offensive. The American platoon was cut off, running low on ammunition with wounded men who couldn't be evacuated. The Germans were preparing their final assault when the artillery had started falling. Not random fire, not suppressive barrages, but surgical strikes that landed exactly where they would do the most damage. Machine gun nests, command posts, rally points. The shells had found them all with impossible accuracy, and the fire had been called in by one man. One wounded radio man who'd stayed on the air even as the Germans concentrated all their fire on his position, even as his own position was being hit by American artillery. He was insane, one German sergeant told his interrogators, still shaken days later. No sane man does that. No sane man calls fire on himself. But St. Germain hadn't been insane. He'd been desperate, calculating, and clear-eyed about his own death. He'd done the mathematics of survival and accepted the equation's answer. The Germans were furious when they learned the full story. Not at Saint-Germain you could respect an enemy's courage even when it defeated you, but at the situation itself. They'd been beaten by a dying man with a radio. One soldier, already mortally wounded, had stopped an entire assault and saved his platoon through sheer force of will and precise fire coordination. It violated their sense of how battles should work. Superior numbers, superior position, superior firepower. These should have guaranteed victory. But they'd been defeated by something they couldn't counter. A man who was willing to die to accomplish his mission. The story spread through the German ranks, became one of those cautionary tales soldiers tell each other. Be careful of the American radio men. They're crazy. They'll call artillery on their own heads just to take you with them. It wasn't true, of course. Saint-Germain wasn't crazy, and most radiomen didn't have to make his terrible choice. But the story served its purpose. It added another layer of uncertainty to an already uncertain war. Another reason for German soldiers to question whether victory was possible against an enemy this determined, this willing to sacrifice. Lieutenant James Kearney survived the war. He came home to Pennsylvania with a Purple Heart, a Silver Star, and a shoulder that never quite worked right. He became a high school history teacher, married a woman named Dorothy, had 3 children. He never spoke much about the war with his family. What was there to say? How do you explain to your daughter, helping her with homework at the kitchen table, that you once watched a man die to save you? That you gave the order that made that death necessary? But once a year on Christmas Eve, Kearney would drive to a Catholic church in downtown Pittsburgh, not his own church, but one that stayed open late for midnight mass, and he would light a candle. He never told anyone who the candle was for. Corporal James Rodriguez went back to Texas, used his GI Bill benefits to become an accountant, raised 5 kids in a house in El Paso. He named his youngest son Lloyd. When people asked why, he'd say it was a family name, which was true in all the ways that mattered. Rodriguez did talk about the war, but only about the funny parts, the adventures, the time he and Sullivan had liberated a German officer's stash of wine and gotten spectacularly drunk. He never mentioned the forest near Kemen. He never mentioned the radio man who'd saved his life. But in 1967, when Lloyd Rodriguez Jr. turned 18 and announced he was enlisting to go to Vietnam, James Rodriguez sat him down and told him a story about a young man from South Dakota who'd carried a radio through France and Luxembourg, about a Christmas Eve when death had come calling, about the choice one man had made when there were no good choices left. If you're going to go, Rodriguez told his son, then understand this. Sometimes courage isn't about attacking or advancing. Sometimes it's about standing your ground when every instinct tells you to run, about doing your job when doing your job means dying. Lloyd Jr. went to Vietnam. He came back. His father never asked what he'd seen there. Private First Class Mike Sullivan's war ended 2 weeks after Kemen, when a German 80-millimeter shell landed in the building he was occupying in France. He lost his left leg below the knee and his right eye. The Army discharged him with a disability pension, and he went back to Boston, where he worked as a dispatcher for a taxi company. Sullivan drank. More than he should have. Enough that his wife threatened to leave him, though she never did. Enough that his kids learned to stay out of his way when he got that look in his eyes, that 1,000-yard stare that meant he was back in the war, back in that frozen forest. But he was functional. He held a job. He paid his bills. He showed up to Veterans of Foreign Wars meetings and sat in the back, nursing a beer, listening to other men tell their war stories without ever telling his own. He only told it once, to a young reporter from the Boston Globe who was doing a feature on D-Day veterans in 1984. The reporter had asked Sullivan about his worst day in combat, expecting to hear about D-Day, about the beaches. Instead, Sullivan told him about Christmas Eve, 1944, about a kid from South Dakota who'd weighed maybe 160 soaking wet, who'd carried a 38-pound radio and never complained, about how that kid had saved Sullivan's life by giving up his own. The thing is, Sullivan said, Lloyd didn't die quick. He had time to think about it, time to understand what he was doing, and he did it anyway. He stayed on that radio, called in fire missions, adjusted the artillery, the whole time bleeding out, the whole time knowing he was done. The reporter asked if Sullivan felt guilty about surviving. "Every goddamn day," Sullivan said. "But Lloyd didn't die so I could feel guilty. He died so I could live. So all of us could live. And I figure the best way to honor that is to actually live, not just breathe, but really live, be a good father, try to be a good man. Because if I waste this life he gave me, then what was the point?" The article ran on page 6 of the Metro section. Most people skipped it, but one reader didn't. Margaret St. Germain received 2 letters about her son's death. The first arrived in January 1945, an official War Department telegram delivered by a Western Union boy who looked about 12 years old. She'd opened it standing in the doorway of her farmhouse in South Dakota, wine cutting across the frozen prairie, her hands shaking so badly she could barely read the words. "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son, Private Lloyd J. St. Germain, was killed in action in Luxembourg on 24th December, 1944. She'd sat down on the porch steps, still holding the telegram, and she'd stayed there for 3 hours while the temperature dropped and the sun set, and her daughter Martha came home from school and found her there, frozen and silent. The second letter came in March, handwritten, 6 pages of cramped script on lined paper torn from a notebook. It was from Lieutenant James Kearney, 317th Infantry Regiment, 80th Infantry Division. "Dear Mrs. St. Germain, I am writing to tell you about your son. The Army will send you official reports about how he died, and those reports will use words like heroic and distinguished service, and above and beyond the call of duty. Those words are all true, but they don't tell you what I need to tell you. Lloyd saved my life. He saved 23 men's lives, actually, but he saved mine specifically, and I need you to know that." Kearney's letter described the battle in detail, more detail than the War Department would ever provide. He described how Lloyd had been wounded early, how he'd refused evacuation, how he'd stayed on the radio coordinating artillery while German bullets tore apart his cover. He described the decision to call fire on their own position and how Lloyd had volunteered to remain on the air to adjust that fire. But he also described other things, how Lloyd had been reliable, steady, the kind of soldier you could count on, how he'd shared his cigarettes with guys who'd run out, how he'd written letters home every week, without fail, even when they were in combat, how he'd talked about the farm, about his family, about the life he was going to live after the war. Near the end of the letter, Kearney wrote, "I gave the order that resulted in your son's death. I approved the fire mission. I made the tactical decision. That was my responsibility as his commanding officer, and I will carry that weight for the rest of my life. But you should know that Lloyd volunteered. I didn't order him to stay on that radio. He chose to. He understood what it meant, and he chose to do it anyway, because it was the only way to save the rest of us. I don't know if that makes it better or worse for you. I don't know if knowing he chose it helps. But I thought you should know that your son died exactly the way he lived, doing his job, taking care of his buddies, thinking about others before himself. I'm sorry I couldn't bring him home to you. I'm sorry for a lot of things. But I'm not sorry I knew him. I'm not sorry he was in my platoon. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what he gave." Sincerely, Lieutenant James P. Kearney, Margaret St. Germain read that letter once a year on Christmas Eve, sitting in Lloyd's old room with the door closed. She never told anyone about it. Some things were too private, too painful, too precious to share. But she also kept living. She raised Martha, her youngest daughter. She kept the farm running through the lean post-war years. She went to church every Sunday and smiled at her neighbors and baked pies for community functions. She did all the normal things that made up a life. And slowly, over years, she came to understand something that Kearney had understood, that Rodriguez and Sullivan and all the survivors had understood. Lloyd's death hadn't been a tragedy. It had been a choice, a terrible, necessary, deliberate choice made by a young man who'd seen clearly what needed to be done and had done it. Her son hadn't been a victim. He'd been a soldier who'd done his job to the very end. And there was honor in that. There was meaning. It didn't stop the hurt, but it made the hurt bearable. The SCR-300 radio that Lloyd St. Germain had carried through his last battle was recovered from the battlefield and sent back to a depot in France for inspection and repair. The Signal Corps technicians who examined it wrote a detailed report. The radio had taken 7 direct bullet hits, 2 through the battery pack, 3 through the main housing, 2 through the antenna mount. Shrapnel from the artillery barrage had riddled the case. The blood-soaked canvas carrying harness had to be cut away and discarded. By all rights, the radio should have been destroyed, should have stopped working after the first few hits. But it hadn't. It had kept transmitting until the moment St. Germain's heart had stopped, and even then, the carrier signal had continued for another 30 seconds before the tubes finally failed. "I have never seen," wrote Captain Thomas Morrison, the senior Signal Corps officer who reviewed the report, "a piece of equipment that sustained this level of damage while remaining operational. This radio and the man who operated it represent the absolute pinnacle of reliability under fire." The radio was supposed to be stripped for parts and the remains sent to salvage. Instead, Morrison had it crated up and shipped to the Signal Corps Museum at Fort Gordon, Georgia, where it was displayed with a small placard that read, "SCR-300 radio operated by Put Lloyd J. St. Germain 317th Infantry Regiment, 80th Infantry Division Kemen, Luxembourg, December 24, 1944. This radio remained operational despite severe combat damage, enabling successful fire missions that saved an American platoon. The radio sat in that museum for 40 years, one artifact among hundreds, seen by thousands of soldiers in training who barely glanced at it. Until 1985, when a young Signal Corps lieutenant named Jennifer Morrison, Thomas Morrison's granddaughter, was going through her grandfather's papers after his death and found the original damage assessment report. She read it. Then she read it again. Then she started digging. She found Kearney's after-action report, found Rodriguez's survivor testimony, found Sullivan's account in the Old Boston Globe article, found Margaret St. Germain's obituary from 1978, which mentioned her son Lloyd, killed in action during the Battle of the Bulge. Jennifer Morrison wrote a 20-page report titled Radio Operations Under Fire, a case study in communications reliability and operational courage. She submitted it to the Army War College. It was published in their quarterly journal. Military historians began to notice. In 1987, the Army posthumously awarded Private Lloyd St. Germain the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military decoration for valor. The ceremony was held at Arlington National Cemetery. Lieutenant Kearney was there, 70 years old now, leaning on a cane. Rodriguez came from Texas, Sullivan from Boston. 23 men had survived that Christmas Eve. By 1987, only 7 were still alive. All 7 attended. They stood together as a brigadier general presented the medal to Lloyd's sister Martha, now 65, her hair white, her hands shaking as she accepted the blue ribbon cross. "Your brother," the general said, exemplified the finest traditions of American military service. His actions on December 24, 1944, demonstrated extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty. He gave his life so that his comrades might live, and in doing so, he earned a place among the immortal heroes of our nation. Pretty words, official words, the kind of words that go in citation documents and get read at ceremonies. But afterward, when the ceremony was over and the dignitaries had left, the 7 survivors stood together around Martha St. Germain, and they told her the real story. Not the sanitized version, not the heroic version, but the true one. They told her about the scared kid from South Dakota who'd carried a radio and never complained. About how he'd made bad jokes and written letters home, and dreamed about apple pie. About how he died slowly, bleeding and in pain, but never stopped doing his job. About how they'd owed him their lives for 43 years, and would owe him for however many they had left. He was just a regular guy, Rodriguez said. That's what I want you to know. He wasn't some superhero. He was just Lloyd, and he did what he thought was right. And that made all the difference. Martha St. Germain, who'd been 8 years old when her brother died, who'd grown up with only a few fuzzy memories of him, nodded and cried and understood, finally, who her brother had been. The forest near Chemin, Luxembourg, looks different now. The trees that were splintered by artillery in 1944 have long since been cleared, and new growth has taken their place. The shell craters have filled in, covered by decades of fallen leaves and winter snows. You'd never know, walking through it on a spring day in 2024, that men had fought and died here 80 years ago. But there's a marker. Small, easy to miss if you're not looking for it. A simple stone placed by the Luxembourg government in 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the battle. It's written in 3 languages, Luxembourgish, German, and English. On this site, 24th of December, 1944. Private Lloyd St. Germain, U.S. Army, gave his life to save his comrades. Greater love hath no man than this. The marker sees few visitors. The Battle of the Bulge sites in Bastogne, just 40 miles south, draw thousands of tourists every year. But Chemin is off the beaten path, hard to find, barely mentioned in guidebooks. Sometimes, though, American veterans come, sons and daughters of the men who fought in the 80th Division. Grandchildren now, great-grandchildren, tracking down the places where their ancestors served. They find the marker, take pictures, spend a few minutes in silence. And every Christmas Eve, without fail, someone leaves flowers. Fresh ones. Red roses usually, sometimes white carnations. No note, no name. Just flowers placed carefully at the base of the stone marker, a silent acknowledgement of sacrifice. The locals in Chemin know about it. They've seen it happen for decades now, though the person leaving the flowers always comes at night, unseen. Some say it's one of the survivors, coming back year after year to honor his comrade. Others say it's family, a niece maybe, or a grandnephew, keeping the memory alive. The truth is simpler and more complicated than either guess. The flowers are left by a network. Former Signal Corps personnel scattered across America and Europe who learned Lloyd St. Germain's story during their own service. They take turns, coordinate through email and phone calls, make sure that on December 24th every year, that marker doesn't stand alone. Because St. Germain's story became part of Signal Corps lore. Every radio operator learns it eventually, usually from an older NCO who heard it from someone who heard it from someone who was there. It's not in the official training manuals, but it's part of the culture, part of the tradition. It's the story they tell young soldiers who complain about carrying the heavy radios, about being the guy with the antenna that draws enemy fire. They tell them about a kid from South Dakota who carried his radio through hell and used it to save his friends. They tell them that being a radio operator means you never quit, never go silent, never abandon your mission. Sometimes you die doing it. But the job matters more than the man doing it. That's the lesson. That's what Lloyd St. Germain taught with his life and his death. Not that sacrifice is glorious, it isn't. Not that war is noble, it's horrible. But that when you're given a job and lives depend on you doing that job, you do it, even if it costs you everything. Especially if it costs you everything. The radio that Lloyd St. Germain carried is still at Fort Gordon, still on display. But it's in a different place now, not tucked away in a corner, but in the main hall, lit by spotlights, with a full explanatory panel that tells his story. Young Signal Corps soldiers in training walk past it every day. Most barely glance at it. They're 18, 19, 20 years old, the same age St. Germain was. They're thinking about their training exercises, their smartphones, where they're going to be deployed, whether they'll see combat. But some stop. Some read the panel. Some stand there for a while, looking at the battered radio with its bullet holes and shrapnel damage, and they understand something fundamental about the job they've chosen. The radio isn't the artifact. The radio is just metal and tubes and wire. The real artifact is the choice Saint Germain made, the decision to stay on the air, to keep calling in coordinates, to turn his death into something meaningful. That choice lives on. In every radio operator who stays at their post under fire, in every forward observer who calls in artillery danger close to their own position, in every soldier who puts the mission above their own survival, because the mission is bigger than any one life. Lloyd St. Germain died at 22 in a frozen forest in Luxembourg. But his choice, that terrible, necessary, heroic choice, is immortal. It echoes forward through 80 years of history, through generations of soldiers, through every crisis where someone has to decide whether to run or stand. He stood. He called the fire. He saved his friends. And in the end, that's all any of us can hope to do. Face the moment that matters, make the hard choice, and trust that our sacrifice means something to someone, somewhere, somehow. The Germans were furious when they found out how one wounded radioman had stopped their entire assault. Furious because it shouldn't have been possible. Furious because it violated their tactical calculations. Furious because they'd been beaten by a dying man who refused to quit. But maybe they were also, in some small way, respectful. Because courage is courage, regardless of what uniform it wears. And what Lloyd St. Germain did on that Christmas Eve wasn't just brave. It was impossible, until he did it. That's the real story. Not the hero's journey, not the triumphant ending, but the simple truth of a young man who did his job until he couldn't anymore, and saved lives in the process. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Lloyd St. Germain understood that, and on December 24, 1944, in a forest in Luxembourg, he lived it.